Harold Thompson stood near the entrance of his restaurant, surveying the evening crowd with the same discerning eye he had honed over the years. The restaurant, Limone Elegante, was more than just an upscale dining establishment. It was a symbol of Harold's success. Nestled in one of the city's most exclusive neighborhoods, Limone Elegante was known for its exquisite French cuisine, impeccable service, and an atmosphere that whispered luxury. Harold had built the restaurant's reputation from the ground up, and now it was the go-to place for the city's elite. Lawyers, politicians, celebrities, and business moguls all came through its doors, drawn by the promise of privacy and a dining experience unmatched by any other. To Harold, maintaining the restaurant's image was paramount. Every detail mattered, from the pristine white tablecloths to the perfectly arranged floral centerpieces on each table. The soft glow of crystal chandeliers bathed the room in warm light, while the faint sound of classical music played in the background, adding to the ambiance. The restaurant was designed to exude elegance, and Harold took great pride in ensuring that only a certain type of clientele walked through its doors. Harold himself was a man of distinction. In his early 60s, with silver hair neatly combed back and a sharp suit tailored to perfection, he carried himself with an air of authority. His features were sharp, his posture impeccable, and his demeanor always calm and controlled. His wealth was evident not just in his appearance, but in the way he conducted himself. He was proud of what he had achieved, and he believed that the exclusivity of his restaurant was a reflection of his success. However, beneath that polished exterior lay a man who held certain beliefs about who belonged in his establishment and who did not. Though Harold was careful never to display overt racism, those who knew him well were aware of his prejudices. He prided himself on being able to make subtle judgments about people, often based on their appearance, background, or behavior. To him, Limone Elegante was a sanctuary for people of class, and he was determined to keep it that way. This meant that certain individuals whom he deemed unfit for his establishment were quietly but deliberately discouraged from returning. That evening, as Harold stood at the entrance, he noticed a couple approaching the restaurant. They were impeccably dressed, the man in a tailored black suit with a distinctive flair, and the woman in a stunning red dress that flowed elegantly as she walked. Their outfits were tasteful, sophisticated, and entirely appropriate for the restaurant, but Harold's gaze narrowed as they came closer. The couple, Snoop Dogg and Shante Broadus, were black. For a moment, Harold's smile faltered. It was a subtle reaction, one that would have gone unnoticed by most, but to those who knew him, it was a telltale sign of his disapproval. Snoop Dogg, with his unmistakable swagger and iconic braided hairstyle, walked with a calm confidence that turned heads effortlessly. Beside him, Shante carried herself with grace and poise, her radiant smile and natural elegance lighting up the dimly lit entrance. They were a striking pair, a picture of success and style. Yet to Harold, their presence set off a cascade of judgments in his mind. He immediately questioned whether they belonged in his restaurant, whether they fit the image he had so carefully cultivated over the years. As Snoop and Shante reached the entrance, Harold forced a smile and greeted them with his usual polished courtesy. "Good evening," he said, his tone smooth and practiced. "Do you have a reservation with us tonight?" "Yes, we do," Snoop replied with a cool smile, glancing down at Shante briefly. "It's under the name Broadus." Harold nodded, but internally he was already making judgments. He couldn't help but wonder if their reservation was a mistake, or if they had somehow managed to slip through the cracks in his carefully controlled reservation system. He glanced at his maitre d', who was standing a few steps behind him, and gave a barely perceptible nod. The maitre d' quickly checked the reservation list, then looked back at Harold with a subtle expression that confirmed the reservation was indeed legitimate. "Ah, yes, Mr. Broadus," Harold said, his voice betraying none of his thoughts. "Right this way, please." As he led Snoop and Shante through the restaurant, Harold couldn't help but notice the glances from some of the other patrons. They were the usual clientele, wealthy, predominantly white, and accustomed to a certain atmosphere. A few diners raised their eyebrows, while others exchanged looks that conveyed a shared understanding. Harold knew what they were thinking, because he was thinking it too. What were Snoop Dogg and Shante Broadus doing here? The couple's presence disrupted the unspoken, carefully curated image of exclusivity that Harold had worked so hard to maintain. He guided them to a table near the back, close to the kitchen doors and away from the center of the dining room. It was a table Harold reserved for guests he considered less desirable, those who didn't quite fit the mold of what he believed his restaurant represented. The placement was deliberate, a subtle way of sending a message. As they approached the table, Harold gestured for them to sit. "Here we are," he said, his tone as polite as ever. "I hope you enjoy your evening with us." Snoop and Shante exchanged a quick glance but said nothing. They took their seats, with Snoop pulling out a chair for Shante before sitting down himself. Harold lingered for a moment longer, studying them with a critical eye. He noted their composed demeanor, the way they held themselves with dignity and grace. But instead of appreciating their elegance, Harold saw only what he wanted to see. Two people who, in his mind, didn't belong in his restaurant. "Thank you," Shante said, her voice soft but firm. "We're looking forward to it." Harold nodded curtly and walked away, but his mind was still occupied with thoughts of the couple. He couldn't shake the feeling of unease that their presence had stirred within him. It wasn't just that they were black. It was that they carried themselves with a confidence that challenged his preconceived notions. He was used to people being intimidated by the exclusivity of his restaurant, but Snoop and Shante seemed entirely comfortable, as if they belonged there just as much as anyone else. Back at the entrance, Harold pulled the maitre d' aside and whispered, "Keep an eye on them. Make sure everything is handled appropriately." The maitre d' nodded in understanding. "Of course, Mr. Thompson." Harold returned to his post, his thoughts still lingering on Snoop and Shante. He didn't like the unsettled feeling they gave him, but he couldn't deny it. Something about the couple made him uneasy, and that unease only fueled his determination to assert control over the situation. As the evening progressed, Harold kept glancing in their direction, watching for any sign that would justify his discomfort. But Snoop and Shante gave him nothing. They were the epitome of class and grace, treating the staff with respect and behaving impeccably. Their very presence seemed to challenge everything Harold believed about who should and shouldn't be in his restaurant. Despite their calm demeanor, Snoop and Shante were keenly aware of the undercurrent of hostility directed at them. They noticed the way the waitstaff seemed hesitant to approach their table, the way other diners occasionally glanced their way before quickly looking away. It was as if they were being watched, judged, every move they made scrutinized for some imagined fault. But instead of reacting, they remained composed, determined not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing them uncomfortable. For Snoop and Shante, this dinner was supposed to be a special occasion. It was their 25th wedding anniversary, a milestone they had been looking forward to celebrating. They had chosen Limón Elegante not only because of its reputation, but because they believed that their hard work and success deserved to be recognized in a place like this. They had heard about the restaurant's exclusivity, and had even seen it featured in high-end magazines. To them, it represented a reward for their achievements, a place where they could relax and enjoy each other's company without the pressures of daily life. But from the moment they stepped through the door, they had sensed the tension in the air. They noticed the way Harold's smile didn't quite reach his eyes, the way he guided them to a table that seemed oddly out of place in such a refined setting. They were no strangers to subtle racism. They had encountered it before in different forms and places. Still, they had hoped that tonight would be different, that they could simply enjoy their evening without any of the complications that often came with being black in spaces dominated by white patrons. As they sat at the table, Shante reached across to take Snoop's hand. "It's a beautiful restaurant," she said quietly, her eyes scanning the room. Snoop nodded, though he could sense what Shante wasn't saying. "It is," he replied, squeezing her hand gently. "Let's make the most of it." They both knew what was happening, but they refused to let it ruin their evening. They had learned long ago how to navigate situations like this, how to rise above the microaggressions and slights that seemed to follow them wherever they went. Tonight was supposed to be about them, about celebrating their love and the life they had built together. They wouldn't let Harold's narrow-mindedness take that away from them. Harold, meanwhile, continued to wrestle with his own conflicting thoughts. On one hand, He prided himself on maintaining a veneer of professionalism and politeness, never openly displaying his prejudices. But on the other hand, he couldn't help but feel that Snoop and Shantae were somehow challenging his authority simply by being there. He resented them for disrupting the carefully cultivated image of his restaurant, for daring to act as if they belonged in a place that, in his mind, was reserved for people of a different class. His class. The evening at Limone Elegante was in full swing. Diners chatted quietly at their tables, sipping fine wines and savoring delicate dishes prepared with the utmost care. The clink of silverware on porcelain and the murmur of conversation filled the air, creating an ambiance of refined tranquility. For Harold Thompson, everything was as it should be. Everything except for the presence of Snoop Dogg and Shantae Broaddus. The couple had been seated for a while now, patiently waiting for their meal to arrive. They had done everything by the book, made a reservation well in advance, arrived on time, and conducted themselves with the utmost politeness. Yet Harold's irritation simmered just below the surface. He couldn't shake the feeling that they didn't belong here, that their presence disrupted the carefully crafted atmosphere of his establishment. He was determined to find a way to reassert control, to remind them that this was his restaurant. Harold's first move was subtle, but deliberate. He instructed the waitstaff to delay serving Snoop and Shantae's food. While other tables received their orders promptly, the couple's appetizers were conspicuously late. Snoop and Shantae exchanged a glance but said nothing, choosing instead to sip their water and engage in quiet conversation. They had noticed the delay, but they refused to let it spoil their evening. As the minutes ticked by, Harold's frustration grew. He had hoped the delay would make Snoop and Shantae uncomfortable, perhaps even provoke them into complaining, but they remained calm, unbothered by the obvious slight. Their composure only irritated Harold further. He felt as though they were mocking him with their poise, silently challenging the unspoken rules of his restaurant. After what felt like an eternity, a waiter finally approached their table with the appetizers. The young man looked nervous as he set the plates down, aware of the tension in the air. Harold had made it clear to his staff that Snoop and Shantae were not to be given the same level of service as the other guests, and the waiter had followed his instructions to the letter. "Sorry for the delay," the waiter mumbled, avoiding eye contact as he placed the dishes on the table. "No problem," Snoop replied with a polite smile. "Thank you." The waiter nodded quickly and retreated, eager to escape the discomfort of the situation. As Snoop and Shantae began to eat, Harold watched them from across the room, his mind racing. They were too composed, too unflappable. He needed to do something more direct, something that would make it clear they were not welcome here. Leaning in close to his maitre d', Harold whispered, "I want you to check their reservation again. Make sure it's legitimate." The maitre d' hesitated for a moment, sensing the underlying hostility in Harold's request, but he knew better than to question his boss. "Of course, Mr. Thompson," he replied, bowing slightly before hurrying away to carry out the order. A few minutes later, the maitre d' returned, confirming that the reservation was indeed valid. Harold felt a surge of anger. He had been hoping for an excuse, any excuse, to confront the couple directly. But with their reservation confirmed, he couldn't simply throw them out without risking a scene. Still, Harold was not one to give up easily. Determined to assert his authority, he decided to approach the couple himself. He straightened his suit jacket, put on his most practiced smile, and walked over to their table. Snoop and Shantae looked up as he arrived, their expressions polite but guarded. "Mr. Broaddus, Mrs. Broaddus," Harold began, his tone smooth but with a hint of condescension. "I trust you're enjoying your evening so far." "We are, thank you," Shantae replied, her voice calm and measured. "Good, good," Harold said, nodding slowly. "I wanted to personally ensure that everything was to your satisfaction. You see, we pride ourselves on providing an exceptional dining experience here at Limone Elegante, and I'd hate for anything to be out of place." There was a subtle edge to Harold's words, a suggestion that something about Snoop and Shantae was indeed out of place. The couple understood the implication immediately, but they refused to rise to the bait. "Everything has been fine," Snoop said, his voice steady. We appreciate your concern." Harold's smile tightened. He could sense they were not going to be easily intimidated, but he wasn't ready to back down. "I couldn't help but notice," he continued, his tone now more pointed, "that your reservation seemed to have caused a bit of confusion earlier. It's rare that we encounter such unusual circumstances." Shante raised an eyebrow. "Unusual circumstances?" Harold nodded, his smile never wavering. "Yes, well, we don't often receive reservations from—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Guests who are new to our establishment." Snoop and Shante exchanged a glance. They knew exactly what Harold was implying, but they weren't about to give him the satisfaction of reacting. Instead, Snoop responded with the same polite composure he had maintained all evening. "We made the reservation through the same process as anyone else," Snoop said. "I'm sure it was no different from any other reservation you've received." Harold felt his irritation growing. They were too composed, too unshakable. He had expected them to react, to give him a reason to assert his authority more forcefully. But instead, they remained calm, refusing to rise to his provocations. Of course," Harold said, his voice tightening. "I just wanted to make sure everything was in order. You understand, of course, that we have certain standards to maintain here." "We understand," Shante replied, her voice cool. "And we appreciate your attention to detail. It's why we chose to celebrate our anniversary here." Harold's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. They had mentioned their anniversary, a detail he hadn't known before. For a brief moment, he considered backing down, letting the matter rest, but his pride wouldn't allow it. He had made up his mind that Snoop and Shante didn't belong here, and he wasn't going to let them enjoy their evening without reminding them of that fact. "Well," Harold said, straightening up slightly, "I'm glad to hear that. But I must say, I'm surprised you chose Limone Elegante for such a special occasion. It's not the sort of place one typically finds your type of clientele." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their meaning. It was the first time Harold had directly referenced their race, and he watched their reactions closely, waiting for a crack in their composure. But Snoop and Shante didn't flinch. Instead, Snoop leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Our type of clientele?" Snoop repeated, his voice steady. "And what type would that be, Mr. Thompson?" Harold hesitated for just a moment, sensing the trap that had been laid for him. But he was too far gone now, too committed to back down. He had to regain control of the situation, no matter the cost. "We cater to a very specific demographic here," Harold said, choosing his words carefully. "Our guests expect a certain atmosphere, a certain level of exclusivity. I'm not sure you quite understand the nature of our establishment." There it was, the thinly veiled insult Harold had been building up to all evening. He had finally said what he had been thinking since the moment Snoop and Shante walked through the door. They didn't belong here, not in his eyes, and he wanted them to know it. For a moment, there was silence at the table. Snoop and Shante exchanged another glance, a silent conversation passing between them. Then, without breaking eye contact with Harold, Snoop spoke. "I see," Snoop said quietly. "Thank you for clarifying that, Mr. Thompson." There was something in Snoop's tone that made Harold uneasy, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He had expected anger, perhaps even outrage. But instead, he was met with calm acceptance. It was as if Snoop had already anticipated this confrontation and was simply waiting for it to play out. Shante leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady. "We appreciate your concern, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice firm but polite. "But I assure you we are fully aware of the nature of your establishment. That's why we chose to dine here. We were looking forward to enjoying a special evening together." Harold felt a flicker of doubt. There was something about the way they spoke, the quiet confidence they exuded, that unsettled him. But he quickly pushed the doubt aside. He was the owner of this restaurant, and he had the final say on who was welcome and who was not. "I'm afraid I must insist," Harold said, his voice growing colder. "I don't believe this is the right place for you. I think it would be best if you left." The words were out before Harold could stop himself. He had crossed the line, and he knew it. But there was no turning back now. He had made his position clear, and he was determined to see it through. Snoop and Shante sat in silence for a moment, letting Harold's words sink in. Then slowly, Snoop stood up. Shante followed suit, her expression calm but resolute. They both knew they could have escalated the situation further, but they also knew it wasn't worth it. This was not the time or place for a fight. They had been disrespected, humiliated even, but they refused to let Harold see them as anything other than dignified. As they gathered their belongings, Harold felt a pang of something he couldn't quite identify. Was it regret? Doubt. He wasn't sure, but he quickly buried the feeling, reminding himself that he had done what needed to be done. He had protected the image of his restaurant, ensured that it remained a place for the right kind of people. But just as they were about to leave, Snoop turned back to face Harold. There was a calm intensity in his eyes, a quiet strength that made Harold suddenly feel very small. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Thompson," Snoop said, his voice steady. "We won't trouble you any further, but remember this: people will always show you who they really are, one way or another." Shante nodded in agreement, her gaze steady. "Have a good evening," she added, her voice polite but firm. With that, Snoop and Shante turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Harold standing there, his hands clenched at his sides. The other diners, who had been watching the confrontation with varying degrees of interest, quickly returned to their meals, pretending not to have noticed what had just transpired. But the tension in the room remained, a lingering unease that hung in the air long after Snoop and Shante had gone. Harold returned to his post, his expression carefully composed. But inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had made a mistake. A small voice in the back of his mind whispered that there would be consequences for what he had done, that this night would come back to haunt him. But Harold ignored the voice, pushing it down along with the uncomfortable feelings that accompanied it. He had won. He had asserted his authority, protected the integrity of his establishment, and that was all that mattered, or so he told himself. But deep down, in a place he rarely allowed himself to acknowledge, Harold knew this was far from over. As Snoop and Shante walked away from Limone Elegante, they exchanged a glance. There was no need for words. They both knew what the other was thinking. They had been humiliated, but they had also seen something in Harold that he had not intended to reveal. His weakness, his fear, his insecurity. And they knew that, in the end, it was Harold who would pay the price for his actions. They had a plan, a way to turn this night of humiliation into something much more powerful. They had the resources, the connections, and, most importantly, the resolve to see it through. For now, though, they walked away quietly, leaving the past behind them as they stepped into the future, one that would look very different for Harold Thompson and Limone Elegante. The battle had just begun. It had been a few days since the incident at Limone Elegante, and Harold Thompson had mostly put the unpleasant evening out of his mind. He had convinced himself that he had handled the situation well, that he had protected his restaurant from the intrusion of people who didn't fit his carefully curated image. To Harold, Snoop and Shante Daniels were a brief, unfortunate disruption, nothing more. He expected that his life and business would continue as they always had, untroubled by the events of that night. But life has a way of turning the tables when one least expects it. It was a quiet morning at the restaurant. The dining area, normally filled with the soft hum of conversations and the clinking of fine china, was empty and still. Harold was in his office, going over the weekly reports, his mind focused on the usual minutiae of running his business. His restaurant was a well-oiled machine, and he took pride in overseeing every detail, ensuring that nothing was left to chance. As he sifted through the papers on his desk, Harold's assistant knocked on the door and entered, holding a sleek envelope. The assistant, a young man named Charles, was typically unflappable, but today there was an unusual note of curiosity in his voice. "Mr. Thompson," Charles said, handing the envelope to Harold. "This came for you this morning. It's marked urgent." Harold took the envelope, frowning slightly as he examined it. The paper was heavy, embossed with a subtle pattern that suggested wealth and sophistication. The return address was from a prestigious law firm, one that Harold recognized as being associated with high-profile clients and significant financial dealings. "Thank you, Charles," Harold said, dismissing the assistant with a wave of his hand. Once he was alone, he carefully opened the envelope, intrigued by its contents. Inside was a letter, printed on fine stationery with the law firm's letterhead at the top. The text was formal and to the point. "Dear Mr. Thompson, we are writing on behalf of a client who has expressed significant interest in acquiring your restaurant chain. Our client, a prominent investor with a substantial portfolio in the hospitality industry, is prepared to make an offer that we believe you will find more than satisfactory. Due to the sensitive nature of this transaction, our client has requested a private meeting to discuss the terms and conditions of the acquisition. Please contact our office at your earliest convenience to arrange a time that suits your schedule. We look forward to your prompt response. Sincerely, Andrew H. Mitchell, Esky, Mitchell, Stevens Company." Harold read the letter twice, a slow smile spreading across his face. The prospect of selling his restaurant chain for a handsome profit was certainly appealing. Though he had no immediate plans to retire, the idea of cashing out at a peak moment was something he had considered in the past. The letter's tone and the law firm's reputation suggested that this offer was serious, perhaps even extraordinary. But there was one detail that piqued his curiosity. The identity of the investor was not revealed. Harold assumed it was a tactic to keep negotiations discreet, but a part of him was eager to know who was behind the offer. Was it a competitor looking to expand? Or perhaps a wealthy entrepreneur seeking to break into the fine dining market? The possibilities intrigued him. Deciding that this was an opportunity worth exploring, Harold immediately contacted the law firm and arranged a meeting for the following day. He felt a surge of anticipation as he hung up the phone. If the offer was as lucrative as the letter suggested, this could be the deal of a lifetime. The next day, Harold arrived at the law firm's office, a sleek building in the heart of the city's financial district. The lobby was all glass and polished stone, a testament to the firm's success and the wealth of its clientele. Harold was greeted by a well-dressed receptionist who escorted him to a conference room on the top floor. The room was spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the city skyline. A large polished table dominated the center of the room, flanked by comfortable leather chairs. Harold was early as usual, and he took a moment to appreciate the luxury of the surroundings. He had always prided himself on being a man of taste, someone who understood the finer things in life. This setting, with its understated elegance, appealed to him. It was the kind of place where deals worth millions were made, where power and influence were quietly wielded. As he waited, Harold allowed himself to imagine what life might be like after the sale. He could travel more, perhaps buy a villa in the south of France or a penthouse in New York. He could invest in other ventures, expand his portfolio, or even start a new business if he wished. The possibilities were endless, and the prospect of such freedom was intoxicating. The door to the conference room opened, and Harold turned, expecting to see a senior partner from the law firm, or perhaps the mysterious investor himself. Instead, he was met with a sight that stopped him cold. Standing in the doorway, impeccably dressed in tailored business attire, were Snoop and Olivia Daniels. For a moment, Harold's mind struggled to process what he was seeing. He had expected a wealthy investor, someone from his world, someone who fit his idea of what a high-powered dealmaker looked like. The last people he expected to see were the same couple he had thrown out of his restaurant just a few days ago. Yet there they were, calm, composed, and exuding an air of quiet confidence. "Mr. Thompson," Snoop said, his voice smooth and professional. "Thank you for coming. We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us." Harold blinked, his usual composure slipping for just a moment. "Mr. Daniels, Mrs. Daniels, I wasn't expecting—" He trailed off, unable to find the words. Shantae stepped forward, her expression polite but firm. "Please, have a seat, Mr. Thompson. We have much to discuss." Still reeling from the shock, Harold found himself moving mechanically, taking a seat at the table. Snoop and Shantae did the same, sitting directly across from him. As they settled in, a team of lawyers and financial advisors entered the room. carrying briefcases and thick folders. They took their places on either side of Snoop and Shante, further emphasizing the couple's authority in this situation. For a few moments, there was silence as everyone took their seats and opened their documents. Harold's mind raced as he tried to make sense of what was happening. How could this be? How could these people, the same people he had dismissed as unimportant, out of place, be sitting here, preparing to negotiate a deal worth millions? Finally, Snoop broke the silence. "Mr. Thompson, I'm sure you're wondering why we're here today. Allow me to explain." He leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "My wife and I are entrepreneurs. We've built a significant portfolio in the hospitality industry, including several high-end restaurants. When we came to Limone Elegante the other night, it wasn't just for our anniversary. We were also evaluating your restaurant as a potential acquisition." Harold felt the floor drop out from under him. He had thought he was dealing with just another couple who didn't belong, but in reality, they had been evaluating him. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, and for a moment, he struggled to maintain his composure. Snoop continued, his voice calm and controlled. "After our experience at your restaurant, we took some time to review our options. We've decided that Limone Elegante and your other establishments would make a valuable addition to our portfolio. That's why we're here today, to make you an offer." Harold blinked, struggling to find his voice. "An offer?" "Yes," Shante said, her tone businesslike. "We're prepared to purchase your entire restaurant chain for a price well above market value. We believe this will be a beneficial transaction for both parties." Harold stared at them, still trying to process the situation. It didn't make sense. Why would they want to buy his restaurants after the way he had treated them? And more importantly, why were they willing to offer more than the market value? There had to be a catch. Seeing the confusion on Harold's face, Snoop decided to clarify. "We're offering you a generous price because we believe in the potential of these establishments. However, there are conditions that must be met for the deal to go through." "Conditions?" Harold echoed, his voice tight. "Yes," Snoop said, leaning back in his chair. "First, the sale must be completed immediately. We don't want this process to drag out over months. We have the resources to finalize the transaction quickly, and we expect the same from you." Harold nodded slowly. That was unusual, but not unheard of in high-stakes deals. He could see the logic in wanting to move quickly, especially if they were serious about expanding their portfolio. "What else?" he asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. "The second condition," Shante said, her gaze locking onto Harold's, "is that you leave quietly. Once the sale is complete, you will step away from the business entirely. No public statements, no interviews, no lingering involvement. You will simply take your profit and move on." Harold's eyes narrowed. This condition was more troubling. He had built these restaurants from the ground up, invested years of his life into making them successful. The idea of walking away without a word, without any acknowledgement of his role, felt like a betrayal of everything he had worked for. "And finally," Snoop added, his voice taking on a harder edge, "you will agree never to open a similar establishment again. You will not compete with us in any way, shape, or form. If you do, we will consider it a breach of contract and pursue legal action." At this, Harold's composure cracked. He had expected a straightforward business transaction, not a hostile takeover. The conditions they were laying out felt like an attack, a deliberate attempt to strip him of his identity and his legacy. He could feel his anger rising, but he forced himself to stay calm, to think rationally. "Why these conditions?" Harold asked, his voice tight with barely suppressed emotion. "Why do you want me out so completely?" Snoop and Shante exchanged a glance before Snoop responded. "Let's just say we believe in doing business with integrity, Mr. Thompson. The way you treated us the other night showed us exactly who you are, and we have no interest in being associated with that kind of attitude. We're offering you a way out, a very profitable way out, but it comes with the understanding that you will step aside completely." Harold felt a flash of indignation. How dare they judge him? They didn't know him, didn't understand the pressures he was under, the image he had to maintain. But as he looked at Snoop and Shante, He realized that there was no point in arguing. They held all the cards now, and they knew it. Still, Harold couldn't help but push back. "And if I refuse, what happens then?" Shantae's expression didn't change, but there was a steeliness in her eyes as she replied, "If you refuse, we'll walk away from this deal, and we'll make sure everyone knows exactly why. Your investors, your clients, the media, they'll all hear about how you treated us. And trust me, Mr. Thompson, in today's world, that kind of story spreads fast." Harold's stomach churned. He knew she was right. A scandal like that could ruin him, destroy everything he had built, his reputation, his business, his future. It would all be in jeopardy. The realization was bitter, but there was no escaping it. He was trapped, cornered by his own actions. The same couple he had dismissed as insignificant now had the power to take everything from him, and there was nothing he could do about it. For a long moment, Harold sat in silence, his mind racing as he considered his options. He could try to negotiate, but he knew it would be futile. Snoop and Shantae had come prepared, and they weren't going to back down. They were offering him a way out, and as much as it pained him to admit it, he knew he had no choice but to take it. Finally, with great reluctance, Harold nodded. "Fine," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "I'll agree to your terms." A small, satisfied smile played on Snoop's lips. "Excellent. Our lawyers will finalize the paperwork, and we can move forward with the sale." Shantae nodded in agreement, her expression softening slightly. "You're making the right decision, Mr. Thompson. This will be good for everyone involved." Harold didn't respond. He didn't trust himself to speak, afraid that his anger and bitterness might spill over. Instead, he simply nodded again, signaling his acquiescence. The meeting continued, with the lawyers going over the details of the contract, outlining the process for the sale. Harold listened in a daze, his mind still reeling from the shock of the situation. It felt surreal, as if he were watching someone else's life unfold. But it was real, too real, and there was no escaping it. By the time the meeting ended, the deal was all but sealed. The final papers would be signed within the week, and then it would be over. Harold would walk away with a substantial sum of money, but at the cost of everything he had worked for, everything that had defined him. As Snoop and Shantae stood to leave, Snoop extended his hand to Harold once more. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Thompson. We'll ensure the transition is smooth." Harold shook his hand, the gesture stiff and formal. "I'm sure you will," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Shantae gave him a polite nod. "Goodbye, Mr. Thompson. We wish you the best in your future endeavors." With that, they left the room, their legal team following close behind. Harold remained seated, staring at the table in front of him, his mind a whirlwind of emotions, anger, resentment, regret. All of it churned within him. But there was also something else, something darker. Fear. For the first time in his life, Harold Thompson felt truly powerless. He had always prided himself on being in control, on shaping his own destiny. But now he realized that his actions, his choices, had led him to this moment. He had no one to blame but himself. As he sat there in the empty conference room, Harold understood that his life would never be the same. He had lost more than just his business. He had lost his pride, his dignity, his very sense of self, and there was no way to undo the damage, no way to turn back time. The twist of fate that had brought Snoop and Shantae into his life had upended everything he knew, leaving him adrift in a world that suddenly felt alien and hostile. All he could do now was accept the consequences and try to find a way forward, though he had no idea what that path might look like. The day Harold Thompson reluctantly signed over his beloved restaurant, La Moni Elegante, to Snoop Dogg and Shantae Broadus was one he would never forget. The crisp, official signatures on the legal documents signified the end of an era for Harold and the beginning of a new chapter for Snoop and Shantae. What had once been his pride and joy, the crown jewel of his career, was now theirs. The deal was done, and there was no turning back. Harold tried to keep his composure as he handed over the final set of keys, his fingers lingering for just a moment before letting them go. Snoop and Shante accepted the keys with the same calm professionalism they had displayed throughout the negotiations. They thanked him politely, offering the same courteous smiles they had given him the first time they stepped into the restaurant. But this time, Harold saw those smiles in a different light. They weren't just polite. They were triumphant. As Harold walked out of the office for the last time, he couldn't shake the feeling of finality that weighed down on him. The restaurant, once a symbol of his success and stature, no longer belonged to him. The realization settled over him like a heavy fog, obscuring any sense of satisfaction he might have felt from the money he had earned in the sale. He had signed away more than just a business. He had signed away a piece of himself. In the days that followed, the sale of Limone Elegante became the talk of the town. The local community, long accustomed to the but, it wasn't just the sale itself that caused a stir. It was the story behind it. The tale people whispered about it in hushed tones, both horrified and fascinated by the turn of events. The story took on a life of its own, morphing into a cautionary tale about pride, prejudice, and poetic justice. As it made its way through the community, the narrative became more dramatic with each retelling. Some people added embellishments, recounting the incident with a touch of schadenfreude, relishing in the downfall of a man who had always thought himself superior to others. Others expressed genuine outrage, shocked that the public announcement of the sale only added fuel to the fire. The local newspaper ran a headline that captured the essence of the story. Restaurateur sells business to couple he once spurned. The article detailed for Harold. The backlash was swift and merciless. His former clients, many of whom had once admired him for his success, began to distance themselves. They had tolerated his quirks and his insistence on maintaining a certain image for his restaurant. But now, with the truth about his behavior laid bare, they saw him in a different light. The racism that had always lurked beneath the surface was now out in the open, and it wasn't something they could ignore. The elite clientele that had once flocked to Limone Elegante began to shun Harold, treating him like a pariah. Invitations to social events dried up, and old friends suddenly became too busy to return his calls. The people who had once praised him for his refined taste and business acumen now whispered behind his back, questioning how they could have ever associated with someone like him. Even those who shared some of his views kept their distance, fearing the stain on their own reputations. Harold's downfall was not just social, it was financial as well. While the sale of the restaurant had left him with a sizable sum, it wasn't enough to maintain the lavish lifestyle he had grown accustomed to. The other business ventures he had invested in began to suffer as word of his behavior spread. Investors pulled out, wary of being linked to a man whose reputation was now tainted. Opportunities that had once been readily available to him began to dry up, leaving Harold with fewer and fewer options. The public reaction wasn't limited to whispers and cold shoulders. Harold began to receive letters and emails from people expressing their disappointment and disgust. Some were polite but firm. Others were openly hostile. Former employees who had once worked under Harold's demanding gaze spoke out about the subtle racism they had experienced during their time at the restaurant. They recounted stories of being passed over for promotions, of being treated differently from their white colleagues, and of enduring Harold's condescending remarks. These revelations only further damaged Harold's reputation. The narrative of his downfall became even more damning as the stories of his discriminatory behavior piled up. It wasn't just the one incident with Snoop and Shante. There was now a pattern, a history of racism that could no longer be denied. The community that had once celebrated Harold as a successful businessman now saw him for what he truly was, a man whose wealth and status had masked a deeply rooted prejudice. Harold's attempts to salvage his reputation were futile. He tried to downplay the incident, insisting that it had been blown out of proportion, that he had merely been enforcing the high standards of his restaurant. But no one was buying it. The damage was done, and there was no way to undo it. His words rang hollow, devoid of the power they once held. The community had made up its mind, and Harold was left to face the consequences. As the months passed, Harold found himself increasingly isolated. The social circles he had once been part of were now closed to him, and the respect he had once commanded had evaporated. He spent his days in solitude, nursing his regrets, and replaying the events that had led to his downfall. He couldn't escape the bitter truth that it was his own actions, his own pride, that had brought him to this point. The regret gnawed at him, a constant reminder of what he had lost. Harold had always prided himself on being a man of principle, someone who lived by his own rules. But now, he was forced to confront the reality that those principles had been rooted in prejudice, in a belief in his own superiority, and that belief had cost him everything: his business, his reputation, his place in the world. The public fallout from the sale also had a profound impact on Limón Elegante itself. Under the ownership of Snoop Dogg and Shante Broadus, the restaurant underwent a transformation. They maintained the high standards and elegance that had made the restaurant famous, but they also brought a new sense of inclusivity and warmth that had been absent under Harold's leadership. The clientele became more diverse, reflecting the changing face of the city, and the restaurant thrived in ways it never had before. For the community, the success of Limón Elegante under new ownership was a fitting conclusion to the story. It was proof that change was possible, that the old ways of thinking could be challenged and overcome. The restaurant, once a symbol of exclusion and elitism, was now a place where everyone felt welcome. And for many, that was the ultimate irony. The very thing Harold had fought to preserve was now flourishing without him, and in spite of him. As the restaurant continued to thrive, Harold's life became a shadow of what it once was. He retreated further into himself, avoiding the places and people that reminded him of his past. The wealth he had accumulated from the sale of the restaurant did little to comfort him. It was a hollow victory, a reminder of what he had lost. He spent his days in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, far from the upscale neighborhood where he had once lived. In his solitude, Harold had plenty of time to reflect on his life, on the choices he had made and the beliefs he had held. He thought about the people he had hurt, the opportunities he had squandered, and the pride that had ultimately been his undoing. The bitterness and resentment that had once fueled him were now replaced by a deep, gnawing regret. But it was too late for regrets. The world had moved on, and Harold was left behind, a relic of a bygone era. The community that had once looked up to him now saw him as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when pride and prejudice go unchecked. And for Harold, there was no redemption, no way to undo the damage he had done. Under the ownership of Snoop Dogg and Shante Broadus, Limón Elegante underwent a transformation that exceeded all expectations. They rebranded the restaurant, shedding its old image of exclusivity and elitism. The new Limón Elegante was a place where everyone felt welcome, regardless of race, class, or background. Snoop and Shante understood that true elegance lay not in exclusion, but in creating an atmosphere of warmth, inclusivity, and respect for all who walked through their doors. The changes implemented were subtle yet powerful. The decor was refreshed to reflect a more modern and diverse aesthetic, blending the restaurant's classic charm with contemporary touches that made it feel both luxurious and inviting. The menu evolved, offering a wider variety of dishes that celebrated different cultures and flavors. Snoop and Shante took great care in ensuring that every aspect of the dining experience was designed to make people feel valued and appreciated. Word of the transformation spread quickly, and soon the restaurant was attracting a broader clientele than ever before. People from all walks of life came to experience the new Limón Elegante, drawn by its reputation for excellence and its commitment to inclusivity. The restaurant became a symbol of positive change in the community, a place where the old barriers of race and class were broken down in favor of a more open and welcoming environment. Business flourished under Snoop and Shante's leadership. The restaurant's revenue soared, and it consistently received glowing reviews from critics and patrons alike. It became a favorite destination for anniversaries, celebrations, and business meetings, and reservations were often booked weeks in advance. Snoop and Shante had succeeded not only in preserving the restaurant's legacy, but in elevating it to new heights. While Snoop and Shante thrived, Harold Thompson watched from the sidelines, now living in obscurity. Harold had been reduced to a mere spectator in the world he once dominated. He followed the success of Limón Elegante from afar, reading the rave reviews in the newspapers and hearing about it from people in the community. Each article, each mention of the restaurant's newfound glory, was a bitter reminder of what he had lost. Harold spent his days in quiet reflection, replaying the events that had led to his downfall over and over in his mind. He thought about the decisions he had made, the pride he had clung to, and the deep-seated prejudices that had ultimately cost him everything. The realization was painful. His racism had not only stripped him of his business, but had also robbed him of an opportunity to grow and evolve as a person. In his younger years, Harold had been proud of the standards he maintained at Limone Elegante. He had convinced himself that these standards were about preserving the restaurant's image, about keeping it exclusive and refined. But now, as he reflected on his past actions, he saw them for what they truly were, an excuse to exclude those he deemed unworthy, to uphold a sense of superiority that had no place in a changing world. The irony of his situation was not lost on him. Snoop and Shante, the very people he had dismissed as not fitting his restaurant's image, had proven to be far more capable and visionary than he had ever been. They had taken what he had built and made it better, turning it into something that resonated with the values of a more inclusive and diverse society. In doing so, they had shown him the true meaning of elegance and success, something he had never fully understood. As the years passed, Harold's bitterness gradually gave way to regret. He came to see that the world had moved on without him, embracing ideals of inclusivity and acceptance that he had resisted for so long. The pride that had once defined him now felt hollow, and the wealth he had amassed brought him little comfort. He was alone, cut off from the community he had once been a part of, with nothing to show for his years of hard work, but memories of what could have been. In a moment of weakness, Harold decided to return to Limone Elegante. Perhaps, he thought, he could find some solace in revisiting the place that had once been his pride and joy. He rationalized that enough time had passed and that it wouldn't hurt to see how things had changed. After all, he had been responsible for the restaurant's initial success, hadn't he? Maybe, just maybe, he could feel some connection to it again. Harold picked up the phone and called the restaurant to make a reservation. The voice on the other end was polite and professional, as expected. He gave his name, Harold Thompson, and requested a table for one on the upcoming weekend. There was a brief pause, followed by a response that made Harold's heart sink. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson," the hostess said, her tone courteous but firm, "but we don't have a reservation under your name." For a moment, Harold was speechless. He had fully expected to be accommodated, to be recognized as the restaurant's former owner, even if he had sold it. But the hostess offered no indication that she knew who he was, and there was no effort to make an exception. He was just another customer to her, one of many who had called to book a table. Harold cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Could you check again? I used to own the restaurant, you see, and—" "I understand, sir," the hostess replied, cutting him off gently. "But our reservation system is quite full. Perhaps you could try another date." Harold thanked her, hanging up the phone with a heavy sigh. The irony was clear. The restaurant he had once controlled, the place where he had turned away Snoop and Shante, now had no place for him. He was just another name on a waiting list, indistinguishable from the countless others who sought to dine at the new and improved Limone Elegante. As Harold sat in his small, modest apartment, the reality of his situation finally hit him. The restaurant had moved on, and so had the world. There was no going back, no reclaiming what he had lost. Snoop and Shante had not only taken over his business, they had done what he had never been able to do. They had turned it into a place that welcomed everyone, that stood as a testament to the values of inclusivity and respect. For Harold, there was no escaping the truth. His downfall had been of his own making. His racism had cost him his business, his reputation, and his place in the world. And now, the restaurant that had once been his pride and joy was thriving without him, a symbol of everything he had failed to understand. The final irony was bitter, but it was also deserved. Harold had tried to preserve an image of exclusivity and superiority, only to see it shattered by the very people he had dismissed. In the end, it was Snoop and Shante who had the last word, turning Limone Elegante into something greater than Harold had ever imagined. And Harold was left with nothing but his regrets, a lone figure in a world that had moved on without him. Under the ownership of Snoop Dogg and Shante Broadus, Limone Elegante underwent a transformation that exceeded all expectations. They rebranded the restaurant, shedding its old image of exclusivity and elitism. The new Limone Elegante was a place where everyone felt welcome, regardless of race, class, or background. Snoop and Shante understood that true elegance lay not in exclusion, but in creating an atmosphere of warmth, inclusivity, and respect for all who walked through their doors. The changes implemented were subtle, yet powerful. The decor was refreshed to reflect a more modern and diverse aesthetic, blending the restaurant's classic charm with contemporary touches that made it feel both luxurious and inviting. The menu evolved, offering a wider variety of dishes that celebrated different cultures and flavors. Snoop and Shante took great care in ensuring that every aspect of the dining experience was designed to make people feel valued and appreciated. Word of the transformation spread quickly, and soon the restaurant was attracting a broader clientele than ever before. People from all walks of life came to experience the new Limone Elegante, drawn by its reputation for excellence and its commitment to inclusivity. The restaurant became a symbol of positive change in the community, a place where the old barriers of race and class were broken down in favor of a more open and welcoming environment. Business flourished under Snoop and Shante's leadership. The restaurant's revenue soared, and it consistently received glowing reviews from critics and patrons alike. It became a favorite destination for anniversaries, celebrations, and business meetings, and reservations were often booked weeks in advance. Snoop and Shante had succeeded not only in preserving the restaurant's legacy, but in elevating it to new heights. While Snoop and Shante thrived, Harold Thompson watched from the sidelines, now living in obscurity. Harold had been reduced to a mere spectator in the world he once dominated. He followed the success of Limone Elegante from afar, reading the rave reviews in the newspapers and hearing about it from people in the community. Each article, each mention of the restaurant's newfound glory, was a bitter reminder of what he had lost. Harold spent his days in quiet reflection, replaying the events that had led to his downfall over and over in his mind. He thought about the decisions he had made, the pride he had clung to, and the deep-seated prejudices that had ultimately cost him everything. The realization was painful. His racism had not only stripped him of his business, but had also robbed him of an opportunity to grow and evolve as a person. In his younger years, Harold had been proud of the standards he maintained at Limone Elegante. He had convinced himself that these standards were about preserving the restaurant's image, about keeping it exclusive and refined. But now, as he reflected on his past actions, he saw them for what they truly were: an excuse to exclude those he deemed unworthy, to uphold a sense of superiority that had no place in a changing world. The irony of his situation was not lost on him. Snoop and Shante, the very people he had dismissed as not fitting his restaurant's image, had proven to be far more capable and visionary than he had ever been. They had taken what he had built and made it better, turning it into something that resonated with the values of a more inclusive and diverse society. In doing so, they had shown him the true meaning of elegance and success, something he had never fully understood. As the years passed, Harold's bitterness gradually gave way to regret. He came to see that the world had moved on without him, embracing ideals of inclusivity and acceptance that he had resisted for so long. The pride that had once defined him now felt hollow, and the wealth he had amassed brought him little comfort. He was alone, cut off from the community he had once been a part of, with nothing to show for his years of hard work, but memories of what could have been. In a moment of weakness, Harold decided to return to Limone Elegante. Perhaps, he thought, he could find some solace in revisiting the place that had once been his pride and joy. He rationalized that enough time had passed, and that it wouldn't hurt to see how things had changed. After all, he had been responsible for the restaurant's initial success, hadn't he? Maybe, just maybe, he could feel some connection to it again. Harold picked up the phone and called the restaurant to make a reservation. The voice on the other end was polite and professional, as expected. He gave his name, Harold Thompson, and requested a table for one on the upcoming weekend. There was a brief pause, followed by a response that made Harold's heart sink. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thompson," the hostess said, her tone courteous but firm, "but we don't have a reservation under your name." For a moment, Harold was speechless. He had fully expected to be accommodated, to be recognized as the restaurant's former owner, even if he had sold it. But the hostess offered no indication that she knew who he was, and there was no effort to make an exception. He was just another customer to her, one of many who had called to book a table. Harold cleared his throat, trying to regain his composure. "Could you check again? I used to own the restaurant, you see, and—" "I understand, sir," the hostess replied, cutting him off gently. "But our reservation system is quite full. Perhaps you could try another date." Harold thanked her, hanging up the phone with a heavy sigh. The irony was clear. The restaurant he had once controlled, the place where he had turned away Snoop and Shante, now had no place for him. He was just another name on a waiting list, indistinguishable from the countless others who sought to dine at the new and improved Limone Elegante. As Harold sat in his small, modest apartment, the reality of his situation finally hit him. The restaurant had moved on, and so had the world. There was no going back, no reclaiming what he had lost. Snoop and Shante had not only taken over his business, they had done what he had never been able to do. They had turned it into a place that welcomed everyone, that stood as a testament to the values of inclusivity and respect. For Harold, there was no escaping the truth. His downfall had been of his own making. His racism had cost him his business, his reputation, and his place in the world. And now, the restaurant that had once been his pride and joy was thriving without him, a symbol of everything he had failed to understand. The final irony was bitter, but it was also deserved. Harold had tried to preserve an image of exclusivity and superiority, only to see it shattered by the very people he had dismissed. In the end, it was Snoop and Shante who had the last word, turning Limone Elegante into something greater than Harold had ever imagined. And Harold was left with nothing but his regrets, a lone figure in a world that had moved on without him. Under the leadership of Snoop Dogg and Shante Broadus, Limone Elegante continued to flourish as a beacon of inclusivity and excellence. The transformation of the restaurant became a case study in how businesses could evolve to reflect the values of a changing society while maintaining their legacy of high-quality service and culinary brilliance. The couple ensured that their vision extended beyond just the walls of the restaurant. They initiated partnerships with local charities, sponsored culinary scholarships for underprivileged youth, and hosted community events that brought people together from all walks of life. The restaurant became a symbol of unity, where diners not only enjoyed exquisite food, but also experienced a space that celebrated diversity and humanity. Snoop and Shante's efforts extended to the staff as well. They implemented training programs focusing on cultural sensitivity, customer service excellence, and career growth. Employees who had once felt overlooked under Harold's leadership now found themselves thriving in a supportive environment. The sense of pride and camaraderie among the team was palpable, and it translated into an unparalleled dining experience for patrons. Critics and diners alike continued to rave about the new Limone Elegante. Articles praised not only the culinary innovations, but also the ethos of inclusion and respect that had become synonymous with the establishment. Awards and accolades poured in, and the restaurant became a must-visit destination for food lovers and cultural enthusiasts alike. Meanwhile, Harold Thompson's life remained a stark contrast to the success of the restaurant he had built. He had become a cautionary tale, often cited in discussions about the perils of unchecked pride and prejudice. The community had moved on, embracing the progressive values embodied by Limone Elegante, while Harold remained trapped in his own isolation. As he watched from afar, Harold couldn't help but marvel at how Snoop and Shante had turned his creation into something far greater than he ever could have imagined. The bitterness he once felt began to give way to an odd sense of admiration. He realized that their success wasn't just a fluke, it was the result of hard work, vision, and a genuine commitment to doing what was right. In a rare moment of introspection, Harold began to wonder if he could have found redemption by embracing change instead of resisting it. The lessons were clear, though the cost had been high. He had learned too late that true success wasn't about excluding others to maintain a sense of superiority. It was about building something that brought people together. Snoop and Shantae, on the other hand, continued to demonstrate what it meant to lead with grace and integrity. Their story became an inspiration, proving that perseverance and a dedication to one's principles could overcome even the most entrenched obstacles. The restaurant stood as a living testament to their journey, a place where the warmth of humanity and the elegance of fine dining merged seamlessly. It was a legacy that resonated far beyond the city, touching lives and setting a standard for others to follow. And so, as Limone Elegante thrived and Harold Thompson faded into obscurity, the world moved forward, reminded once again of the power of humility, inclusion, and the strength it takes to challenge the status quo. Snoop Dogg and Shantae Broaddus had shown not just Harold, but everyone watching that success is sweetest when shared with open hearts and open minds.